The Holocaust changed history. Commentators would state that while many went into the world wars fearing God, many left the world wars fearing man. The Holocaust was a genocide upon the Jewish people to the cost of 6 million Jewish lives. The rise of Adolf Hitler to power brought an outlawing of Jewish identity and a normalizing to remove undesirables from German and Nazi-occupied societies. In 1942, the Nazi High Command made the barbarous decision to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. The final solution, as the Nazis would call it, would litter an entire continent with atrocity in form of extermination camps and more. Yet the most infamous and historically significant of all was one concentration camp complex created in occupied Poland. Confined to brick beds, sentenced to hard labor, given nothing to eat, hanged and flogged, lives were as grim as fates in concentration camps. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we examine life as a Jewish prisoner in Auschwitz. Forever one of history's most notorious place names, Auschwitz was a site of concentration and extermination camps run by Nazis through the occupation of Poland. Following the invasion of Poland in 1939, the SS cited the once Polish army barracks and repurposed it to become the world's most infamous prisoner of war camp. To begin with, the complex in Auschwitz I had a population nearly entirely made up of Polish prisoners. This would be the case for the first 2 years of Auschwitz's operation, though a history-staining sadism would begin to show its teeth in the first year of operation. 9 months into Auschwitz running, functionaries were brought to the camp in May 1940. The functionaries were convicts from German prisons, given superior housing and food and authority to terrorize the prison population. Beatings, torture, and execution became the normalization at Auschwitz I. It would be over a year later till the first gassings of Auschwitz I took place in August 1941. At this point, factory killing was the raison d'etre for concentration camps. In 1942, Auschwitz II, Birkenau, was constructed, and the Nazi final solution for the Jewish population of Europe was underway. For the next 2 years, 1.3 million people were transported on freight trains all across the continent to Auschwitz. 1.1 million would be murdered. Over 900,000 of the lives lost were Jewish, who, in the overwhelming majority, were sent to gas chambers on arrival. Of the hundreds upon hundreds who attempted escape, only 144 of the 1.3 million population ever managed. From the 1933 Nazi clasp of power, Jewish identity was under threat. Europe's long, centuries-old persecution of the Jewish people was hijacked by the Nazis' grim eugenics and racial hygiene philosophy. Before the outbreak of World War II, German Jews were harassed, assaulted, and soon on the run from a country openly outlawing their presence. However, the Nazi march across Europe would soon leave a continent occupied by the ever-growing anti-Semitic force. From 1939, following the invasion of Poland, the Nazis would set up ghettos to segregate Jewish people from the society they lived in. Once Nazi occupation had spread all across Eastern Europe, the anti-Jewish obsession of the Nazis was weaponized, and the regime had half a continent of collaborators. Before the first mass transportation of Jews in Europe in mid-1942, mass shootings, pogroms, and death marches all befell the Jews of Europe. From 1942 to 1944, transportation en masse of European Jews to Auschwitz began. Transportation took place across Europe's railroad network, though this was no transport with consideration for travelers. This was the deporting of unwanted cargo. Freight cars were the actual mode of people being transported. These were normally used for cattle, animals, and cargo. These cars would be filled with people, crammed in, and given nothing in the way of sustenance. Typhoid, dysentery, body lice, and illness were common among the camp arrivals. Chillingly, all was prepared for the arrival of the Jewish population to a glaring extent. The Auschwitz railway station had a specially built ramp for the purpose, the Alte Judenramp. It was situated between the Auschwitz I and II site, which for many imprisoned meant a 2.5-kilometer emaciated walk to Birkenau before being sent to the gas chambers. Those too physically depleted to walk would be transported by trucks. By May 1944, an entirely new set of railway lines had been constructed. The rails in question were laid all the way to just meters away from the camp's gas chambers. Prisoners were woken at 4:30 by the chime of a gong and being beaten with sticks. Prisoners were expected to wash and use the latrines as fast as possible. Though the facilities were meant to be for thousands, they numbered in double digits and had no clean water. A half-liter of coffee or herbal tea was the only sustenance given to prisoners in the morning. Prisoners could wait an entire hour, sometimes made to squat the duration, for the morning roll call. A missing button or an unclean food bowl would likely result in a beating. What followed was the working day, 11 hours of hard labor with no rest. Most of the work was outdoors, taking place in gravel pits, construction sites, and lumber yards. All the work would be overwatched by an escorting SS guard. Disturbingly, an orchestra was on site to play upbeat music as the prisoners set out for their day of labor, as they were being worked to death. The implication of no rest was not just cruelty, but a near science for the Nazis. A single prisoner on any workday would be assigned to watch the latrines. Their role was to measure the time prisoners took to relieve themselves, a petty, perverse detail only sought as something to use against them. The day would end with a second roll call at 7 p.m. This was for the overseers to check there were no escapees, and was a highly consequential matter. Accounts show a single escape could result in an entire group of prisoners being sent to the gas chambers, or simply starved to death. Evening roll call was a ghastly moment in any prisoner's day, many of whom would be flogged or hanged. The final curfew for the day would be called at 9 p.m., when prisoners would retire to their barracks for sleep. Beds were made of brick, with a laying of straw for a mattress. Some would have wooden bunks, with a paper mattress filled with shavings of wood and maybe a blanket. Inmates could fill the brief reprieve before the nightly call to use washing facilities and check any mail that arrived for them, though the Jewish prisoners were denied any contact with the outside world. In a prison of no calendars, clocks, or watches, time was another disbarred reality. Come to the end of the war, only 2 Hebrew calendars were found in all the liberated camps. Sustenance and nutrition for the Jews of Auschwitz were close to ornamental. These people were given enough to keep them vertical for a couple of hours, but well below anything that could sustain a person for a day. Furthermore, these people were subject to day after day of usually hard labor. Their mornings would not bring any food, only a drink of coffee or tea. Food for the day was a weak, watery, disgusting soup, more akin to a broth, and only 3/4 of a liter for a portion. For 4 days a week, there would be scraps of meat in the soup and vegetables 3 times a week. The only other source of food in a day would be approximately 300 grams of regularly moldy bread in the evening. Perhaps most sickeningly, these starved prisoners would be encouraged to save half for breakfast the next day. Following a brutal journey to the Auschwitz camp entrance, all prisoners were tattooed with serial numbers. Soviet prisoners would be tattooed on their left breast. All other prisoners had the serial number tattooed on their left arm. The Nazi system of identification was to sew triangles of colored cloth into the infamous striped clothing provided. Yes, dehumanization began with a color chart. Red for the Poles, black for the Romani, homeless and prostitutes, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, and pink for homosexual men. The Jewish prisoners wore a yellow badge shaped like the Star of David. Nationalities were indefinable by a stitched letter in their clothing. A racial hierarchy was enforced in the camp, and the Jewish prisoners were at the lowest rung. Famous Holocaust survivors include the controversial filmmaker Roman Polanski, the famed author Primo Levi, and iconoclast Simone Weil, who would go on to legalize abortion in France and become the first female president of the European Parliament. Yet not only the famous are fated survivors. Many would follow the footsteps of Elie Wiesel, with his autobiographical accounts of the Holocaust, Night, reflecting their experience in the world. Survivors of the Holocaust have been walking documents of history, never to be forgotten, to be cherished, and the experiences permeated into our consciousness. The world owes much to uphold their legacy, and in one case in particular, their individual legacies held even more. After surviving the Holocaust, Otto Frank was brought the diary of his daughter, Anne, rescued by a friend. With encouragement, Otto brought it to publication, and the culmination of Europe's persecution of the Jewish people was brought its most enduring human face. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.